going to be up there?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's why I was missing the chair.
And you get better grades if you sit in the front row.
Okay.
Well, we'll just remove these chairs.
That-
It's movable, guys, you can move chairs, do whatever you want to do to be comfortable.
Okay, well, I'm Ellen Bishop, as everybody here knows, and basically I am the person who kind of is working on getting Chronicles of Change put together, and we thought that since one of the main changes that is ongoing and extraordinarily important and critical is changes in climate, that we would invite Dr. Erica Fleishman to come here and give us a talk basically about climate and weather and how things are changing. Dr. Fleishman is the director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute at Oregon State University, and she is also a professor in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State. Her specialty basically is ecology, and in particular, ecology and changes, how basically changes in landscape, be that changes in landscape through climate change or changes in landscape through human use of landscapes, affect the ecosystem and affect birds and wildlife, and which in turn affect all of us, basically. She basically is now at Oregon State University, but she has spent most of her life studying east side, more arid and xeric ecosystems, which include currently studies in the Great Basin and Nevada, looking at things that include how birds are adapting to or failing to adapt to climate change. Basically, she's worked for government agencies, philanthropic organizations, done remote sensing, and participated in the science process for management of California's San Francisco estuary and the development of multiple habitat conservation plans. Erica mentioned to me that she feels like she's living in a production of Jack and the Beanstalk, living in Corvallis, where everything grows really, really fast, including trees. So what we would think of as a 100-year-old tree will grow there in 40 years. I think that was the approximate time that anyway, it's a delight to have her with us and to have her actually shed some light on how climate change and what humans are doing to the rest of the ecosystems are affecting us, and in particular weather in Northeast Oregon now and into the future. So, thank you very much.
Thanks for that really kind introduction, and thank you for the introduction or the invitation to come out here. I've been in Oregon since spring 2020, and the timing of that meant that I didn't travel around the state as much as I would have liked initially, so I'm trying to catch up, and it was a real pleasure to come across the state this week, and I look forward to coming back when it's not teaching season to be able to explore a heck of a lot more. So I don't want to stand on ceremony. There may be some people who are online. Hi, I wish you were all here, or that I was there. But for those of you that are here, I don't feel like I have to get through a presentation. Please feel free to make comments, to ask questions, and we can just use the time however you want to use the time. And all of you online will enjoy it, I promise. I also am I'll get into this a little bit more, but I'm really curious to hear what you are seeing and experiencing, in part because there's a dearth of measurements in this part of the state. So I really want to hear what you're seeing, what you're thinking about, what you're experiencing. All right. As Ellen said, I love the Intermountain West. And it's been a real pleasure over the decades to learn about some of the areas in the Intermountain West, to learn some of them really, really well, and then to start being exposed to other places across the Intermountain West, including Eastern Oregon. And it's some of it feels really familiar, of course, and some of it feels different. The trees are bigger here than I'm used to seeing in Central Nevada, for example. It's also a real pleasure to be part of Chronicles. I got into some of the things that I study because I really like ecosystems. I really like, having the solitude of wild places. At the same time, I really value people, really value a lot of the communities that I've worked in, the people that I've gotten to know over the years, and this sums it up pretty nicely. So again, it's really a pleasure to be part of this series in particular. Wouldn't it be nice if this were the case? But not so much. So we're stuck with doing some adaptation. And there's no one right way to do it. Lots of different ways to try to adjust to all of the variability and all of the changes that our environment throws at us. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the changes across Oregon, and especially in northeastern Oregon, and talk about some of the things that are in the discussions that I hear about potential ways to adjust. But again, I'm really curious what you're seeing, what you're thinking about, what you feel is most effective for the places and communities where you are. So Oregon's temperature has been increasing. 34 of the last 37 years were more warmer than the average over about the last century or so. So definitely a warming trend. That doesn't mean that there are no cooler years. It doesn't mean that there are no cooler seasons, but there is a definite trend toward increased temperature. And that's during all seasons, especially during summer. So if you look in a relative sense, summer is warming more quickly than winter is warming. Also in a relative sense, nights are warming more rapidly than days. That is important because of the effects on human health. So basically human bodies, and I think this is intuitive to most of us, especially in Eastern Oregon and other parts of the West, you get nice, cool evenings. You get breezes in the evening. And basically people can cool off. The same thing goes for other animals and plants. Basically, you can take advantage of that passive cooling. When there are warmer nights, people can't cool off as effectively. Also affects building heat loads. I am not a structural engineer, but when I talk to my colleagues that are engineers, they say, we really need to think about that. We need to think about the extent to which it stresses the power supply. If we need to be running electricity for air conditioning later into the evening, for example, affects how buildings are designed. Often there's discussion about the heat index, and Oregon is a leader in passing occupational health laws related to heat that protect workers, that protect outdoor workers. Those are based around the heat index rather than straight temperature. Heat index, most of you are probably familiar with, basically a combined measure of heat and humidity. So sort of an indication of what, sort of like the wind chill, but in reverse, not in reverse, but what the heat feels like when you combine heat and humidity. We're really fortunate in Oregon, especially Eastern Oregon, that humidity is not a big factor. So the heat index in Oregon tends to be really closely related to the overall temperature. Obviously not that way across the country as a whole. So the heat index and the temperatures in Oregon are pretty similar. What I want you to see here, this is illustrating where the weather stations are across the state. Just look at where the dots are and the dots aren't. So basically the weather stations tend to be west of the Cascades where there are higher, where human density is higher. And there are not very many weather stations across much of Eastern Oregon, especially Southeast Oregon, but also Northeast Oregon. And so what this means is that National Weather Service doesn't have a good of a bead on what's happening locally. It means that if scientists are making projections for these regions and trying to evaluate how well the predictions do compared to what's been observed in the past, they don't have as much to go on. So some of the some of the examples that I'm going to be showing relate to Pendleton. Well, why Pendleton instead of Enterprise? Because there aren't as many weather stations here. So really encourage you, if you are interested in some of these issues, to speak with your elected officials at the state level and at the national level and basically say, hey, weather stations are important. They're not sexy. It's hard to get funding in terms of research grants and what have you for weather stations, but really essential for a lot of things. And just there are big parts of the state and big parts of the West where there's just a dearth of on-the-ground data about what's happening with weather patterns. Similar situation if you look at stream gauges, not quite as bad in this area, but again, this is illustrating where there are stream gauges and people can really see what's happening with low flows, high flows. Again, I mean, somewhat corresponding to the wetter parts of the state, but there are big holes across the state, big holes across much of the West in terms of knowing what's actually happening on the ground. So these are just wanted to illustrate some of the trends for this area. So the blue is Medford, the red is Portland, and the green is Pendleton. So just like statewide trends, just like global trends, trend toward more warmer days. So as heat increases, as the average heat increases, we're also getting more heat waves, greater number of heat waves. Heat waves are becoming longer in duration, and the high temperatures are becoming higher. So in every way, the heat is becoming more intense. Not as much of a trend here of number of days with higher cold temperatures. So minimum temperatures are increasing again, not quite as much in this area. Probably true, but again, this is where you really wish you had more weather stations, because you sometimes say, is it an anomaly where that weather station happens to be, or does it seem to be the case across a larger area? And so your observations about what you're seeing, maybe if you have any thermometers in your yards or anything like that, are super valuable. Yeah.
Is there any correlation or studies about the impact of buildings, pavement, asphalt? Because the population areas always have so much more of that, and we have less.
Yeah.
Does that account for anything there in the?
That's a really interesting question. Across a region, a large region, I would lean toward not. Definitely at a hyper-local level, where there are buildings and impervious surfaces, absolutely. And you can see that in a lot of cities. If you just look across a city, the areas with more green space, which often are the more gentrified areas, are up to 10 degrees cooler during a heat wave than the areas that don't have the green spaces, that are much, much more hemmed in, a lot more concrete. I haven't heard it discussed over a larger region. That may be my ignorance. But I will follow up on that. That's a really interesting question.
It just seems like, our population is all on the west side.
Yeah.
Our concrete is all on the west side. Our asphalt is all on the west side.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Again, haven't heard it discussed as much for over a larger area. Certainly for small areas has an effect. But I will follow up on that. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Yeah.
With regard to weather stations?
Yeah.
What weather stations do you use? I mean, there's a lot of private weather stations.
Yeah. In this case, well, so a lot of different types of weather stations can feed into to national networks of information. There are weather stations that are run by the National Weather Service. Some of them are fancier than others. There are several different federal networks that all have slightly different specifications, lots of different options. In some cases, especially with precipitation, the gauges that people are using in their backyards, if they're standardized gauges, can be a really important source of information. So there's the CocoRa's program, for example. I'm not sure if you've heard about this. It's a community observer network on precipitation. And people who sign up to be CocoRa's observers have a standard precipitation gauge that they put in their yards. And so everyone has more or less the same device that's shipped by this really nice lady in the Midwest. And you're given guidelines about, don't put it under the eaves, don't put it somewhere where, you're gonna get snow melt directly into it. But even those really simple gauges, if they're measured consistently and, more or less the same time of day and what have you, can be a really good source of information. So there are a lot of different types of stations that can feed in. There's not one. Yeah. Okay. Really interesting trend in Pendleton, and again, we're not sure why this seems to be an anomaly. So basically, as temperatures increase, the number of cold days decreases, except it doesn't seem to be happening that way in Pendleton. If you look at some of the other parts of the state, and again, it's kind of tricky, are the stations in an anomalous area? I mean, probably not, but we don't really know. This is one of those, what's happening there? So again, kind of interested what your experiences are with the colder days. If you're seeing fewer colder days, or if your perception or your knowledge is that there's about the same number of colder days as there were in the past.
So when you're saying colder days, are
Mm-hmm.
you talking about the average temperature during the day or the low temperature?
The number of days with a low temperature below a certain level. So in this case, the number of days per year below freezing. Yeah, this isn't an average. This graph is just absolute number of days per year. Yeah. Yeah, and you see the variability. So, we're making generalizations off of a long-term trend, and that long-term trend is with a lot of ups and downs. Yeah. And there's always going to be a ridiculous number of ups and downs with anything related to weather. So these are some of this is what some of the trends have been, and you can see different parts of the state having different areas with, again, heat index 90 degrees or higher is very similar across most of Oregon to temperatures 90 degrees or higher. So you can see the places that have been hotter across Oregon. These are observations, not projections. And this is an average number of days per year. So Ontario and Hermiston seem to have won the heat lottery or lost the heat lottery, depending on how you look at it. And this area, not so many days that are really hot over the past 30 years or so.
Excuse me, the fact that we're
Yeah.
4,000 feet, that would be different.
Um,
1 or 2,000 feet.
Not overly much in summer.
So could, just for the sake of people who are on Zoom and may not hear the question, could you repeat the questions before
Sure.
you answer them, please?
Sure. Yeah, there was a question about the overall elevation. May have some effect, but there are still a fair number of high elevation locations with a pretty high number of days over 90. So that's also an interesting question. I am not sure what the elevations of all of these areas are. How much higher are you here than some of the other areas across eastern Oregon? Quite a bit higher? So,
2,000 to 3,000.
okay.
2,000 feet.
Okay, so that may make a difference. I may have misspoken.
That was the question I had about the cold temperatures too, with air
Yeah.
conditions and things, because Pendleton is what, about 2,000 feet?
Yeah, that
1,500
was.
feet?
Mhm.
That was
And
like
we're, like I
1,200.
say, we're sitting,
Yeah.
prices, what, like 33, 30 to 35
Yeah.
in Joseph's. So I was curious about, even in the wintertime, when you're having those temperature
Yeah.
inversions.
I don't know about the inversions in this area. That's something that I can follow up on with people that are more knowledgeable about that than me. Yeah.
Oh, we've got a
Yeah.
question over here.
Just another thing about this map that's interesting is if you plotted a forest cover of Oregon,
Uh-huh.
you would find out that it's mostly in the white there.
Okay.
And I've done studies of extreme maximum land surface temperature with the MODIS data.
Uh-huh.
And forests are incredible regulators of
Okay.
temperature, as you know, I'm sure. And there's a certain threshold of which they don't go.
Okay.
And if they do, it means they're probably experiencing severe stress or dieback. And we found that about 38 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
So yeah, it's very interesting to see the way it's reaching in through the more drier grasslands down the Willamette Valley and the Columbia Plateau. And much of the Blue Mountains is forested and just reaches right through there to the Cascades and of course the Coast Range.
Yeah, super. So for those of you that are online and couldn't hear it, this is an observation that, or I mean, more than an observation, that the areas that are forested tend to be cooler than the areas that are not forested, or where the trees are dying back. Yeah, super interesting. So these are projections now. So this is projected change in the average number of days per year with a heat index of 90 or higher. So, you know, patchier, but especially getting later in the century, even this area not projected to be immune from a trend toward more days over 90. By sort of the middle of the century, you know, not looking as bad as a lot of other areas in the state. And again, as people have been bringing up, the high elevation and the extent to which it's wooded here may help with that, may help modulate some of the high temperatures.
Well, I might, so.
All right, I'm going to move to precipitation. So precipitation is super variable also, but precipitation compared to the last century or so has been below average across Oregon in most of the past 20 some odd years. So what you're going to see here is, you know, what people tend to say is, gosh, there's a lot of lines that are dry years and a lot of lines that are wet years. That's true. And if you look over at the most recent 20 years, you're going to see a lot more lines pointing down than pointing up. You're still going to get a lot of variability. Precipitation is highly variable, and variability almost certainly will continue to dominate Oregon's precipitation patterns in the future. So this is another way of looking at drought. So lots and lots of different ways of looking at drought. One of the most effective ways to look at drought is in terms of not only precipitation, but basically how much water plants are using, how quickly water is being drawn up through plants, and how quickly water is being drawn up through soil. So that's evapotranspiration. So when you take into account both precipitation and evapotranspiration, again, you see this drought trend where droughts are becoming more frequent, they're becoming longer, and they're becoming more intense. And for any of you who want to have copies of these images, I'm happy to provide them, so you don't have to squint too much, and you don't have to, you know, take pictures or anything like that. I'll give you the pictures. So then this is look at the colors. So this is the National Drought Monitor's classification from 1950 to 2020 for counties in northeastern Oregon. And Wallowa is the top one, but what I want you to look at here is just the patterns of color saturation. So what you're going to see is that there's a lot of consistency among the counties. If you look down the rows, or if you look down the columns, I guess, what you'll see is a lot of consistency across the counties in northeastern Oregon, not necessarily surprising. And as you get closer to recent, you'll see more of those saturated reds. That's just another way of looking at drought patterns in this region in general. So yellow is a little bit dry, red is pretty darn dry. So just another way of looking at the same trends in the region. So what is projected? Projected precipitation in this part of the state is projected to increase throughout the water year in the future. That can be a little bit misleading because what is likely to happen is stronger winter storms. Not necessarily more strong winter storms, but just stronger winter storms. So warm air holds more water than cooler air. Air is becoming warmer, holds more precipitation. So likely to have more precipitation in this part of the state in the future in an absolute sense. But that's just looking at how much precipitation falls, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Amount of water that plants need, also likely to go up. So the blue colors here, as you get to more saturated blue, larger projected increase in the amount of water that plants and soils are using. So basically, as temperatures warm again, there might be more precipitation, but plants and soils are using that precipitation more quickly.
Do you think that means in the wintertime we'll have more snow?
Probably less snow.
Because it'll be warmer?
Exactly.
So they're gonna rain instead of snow?
Yes.
More rain.
Yeah.
Repeat
Yeah, the question was, will there be more snow in the winter in this part of the state? And no, there will be more rain.
I wonder if the elevation at 4,000 feet or above makes any difference.
The elevation at 4,000 feet or above probably helps stave off some of the transition, you know, where you are, that you may be above where a lot of the transition is happening in subsequent decades. But likely over the next century, the elevation of this, I mean, it's going to keep going up to some extent. Yeah. And, you know, those shoulder season snows, too, potentially more likely to be rain if it's not that cold when you get a shoulder season storm.
I think what you're hinting at
Mm-hmm.
is snow levels are rising.
Yes, that was a question. Are snow levels rising? Yes, yes.
And here as well.
Yes, snow levels are rising everywhere. Yeah, and that's really big difference in what some of the hazards are for communities across the state with respect to flooding, and also why drought is intensifying. Because if you don't have as much snow, you don't have that natural reservoir, and so water availability, even if in a sense you have more water, it's less available to humans and to natural systems.
You know, I asked an irrigator, a serious irrigator, whether anybody was keeping track of the impact of wind.
Mm-hmm.
Because we had some really pretty heavy rains this spring, but then we had some heavy winds.
Yeah.
And the soil just dries out quicker, you know.
Yeah, this is an observation about the impact of wind. Yeah.
The people are starting to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
And measure it somehow. I don't know who's
Yeah.
doing it, but he thought so.
So this was a question or a comment about the extent to which wind is affecting water supply and irrigation. Yeah, it's interesting. Wind, some of my colleagues have been looking into wind. There's not much indication that winds are becoming stronger in summer. So, I mean, people are thinking a lot about wind with respect to fire hazard. Not that much indication that that winds are strengthening during summer. What is happening is in summer, when strong winds blow, it's more likely to be hot and dry. But winter is a little more ambiguous. Stronger winter storms may be accompanied by stronger winds. There's a whole lot of uncertainty around that, where it's basically winds, difficult to get wind data, difficult to project changes in winds. So that's a big area of just scientists are not sure yet. And hopefully understanding will improve over the coming decades about what's happening with wind. It's important. It affects things like icing on power lines, but we don't know. Yeah, and so this is, again, the projected trend. Whoa, what just happened there? Projected trend in the measure of drought that includes both precipitation and evapotranspiration. Oops, okay, you can't see that. So I'm just going to tell you, because I don't have to do the pictures, and then you don't necessarily have to look at it. So also projected to become drier in this part of the state. Again, even though precipitation across the year is increasing, the projected overall drought patterns, it's more likely that that it will be drier, effectively drier in this part of the state. And we're going to go to technical break for a second.
So if there's more rainfall, how is it drier?
Because it's warmer, and so the water that falls basically evaporates faster. And more of it's coming as rain and less of snow. So basically the storage capacity of that water in the snowpack and in the soils and in vegetation is decreasing. So you can have more water and still have less water available to people and nature. Yeah, it's one of those, like, how is that possible? But because it's getting hotter. Yeah.
What's the metric on this graph?
This is the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. So it's a measure of drought that incorporates both precipitation and evapotranspiration. And then this is looking at basically the trend. And so the blue is trend toward, let's see here. This is projected drought trend. So as you have the warmer colors, drought intensifies. The bluer colors, not necessarily. So somewhat patchy across northeastern Oregon. but sort of, drier to neutral. Yeah.
There are some neat efforts going on locally to try to retain more water in our system.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are people that are, we realize we've channelized the rivers and
Mm-hmm.
flushed the water out as fast as we could, and people are doing river restoration projects to slow it down, and they're building beaver analog dams and also natural beavers. We're utilizing them more and more. People are thinking about how to get more organic matter in the soils. Indigenous folks are really thinking a lot about that.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to figure out ways to keep water in the system as much as we can, because we know
Mm-hmm.
that this is happening.
Yeah.
And some of the things we think, maybe could offset some of this if we can be successful shading streams. Some of our streams have been so overgrazed that they're
Yeah.
just totally exposed to
Yeah.
the sun and everything. So there's numerous ways we're trying to engage with the land now to
Yeah.
help retain water.
Yeah. Are people documenting those efforts to retain more water in the soils and the streams, either with photographs or with measurements or anything like that?
Yeah, in fact, one of our local community members and friends, Ian Wilson, just received an award from Governor Kotek
Nice.
for the river restoration he did on his property. I mean, he lifted up the water
Yeah.
table immensely.
Yeah.
So his is pretty well documented.
Yeah.
And then in other places where we're trying to figure out how to document things.
Yeah.
What do those measurements look like? And
Yeah.
it can be a little tricky with the aquatic systems and the
Yeah.
soils. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's terrific. It's exciting. I mean, all the things that people can do in small areas that make a difference in that area are really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they do seem to make a big difference. And I mean, I'm not taking a position on livestock grazing, but there are a lot of places across the West where if the intensity of livestock grazing is reduced, the vegetation does seem to come back pretty quickly. And in some areas across the West where there's a trend toward more precipitation in spring, again, the vegetation seems to be responding pretty well in areas that have, where some of the precipitation patterns are changing. Also this is more speculative, but some indications that as carbon dioxide concentrations increase, that some plants can become more efficient in their water use. And at least right now, this may not continue indefinitely, that they're basically growing more, that they're taking advantage of that increase in carbon dioxide. All of which, sometimes you mention that and people are a little bit horrified of sort of, but there can't be a good side to anything that's happening with carbon dioxide. And it's sort of, well, do you want it all to be gloom? Because, there are some plants and animals are taking advantage of this, and that's good. I think that's good.
It's interesting, the little bit we've been looking at what the country looked like pre-contact.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've learned is that a lot of the huge changes here, I mean, the first big one was damming the lake. And then, because the whole valley was a lot of marshland, it was spring floods and,
Yeah.
but also it was World War II.
Mm.
And the advent of big caterpillars getting in the rivers and straightening them out.
Yeah.
And I talked to people, I remember that, I was a little girl and I watched the straighten out the Wallowa River.
Yeah.
So the changes have not been, the good changes all along,
Yeah.
but some of the most momentous changes really have occurred in the last 60, 70 years.
Yeah. And gosh, when those channels, the channelization across so much of the West, that is so difficult to reverse.
It was, they had to give those factories that were making tanks something to do, and they made bulldozers.
Yeah. Yeah, you fly over, this was interesting to me in moving from California to Oregon, that you fly over a lot of parts of Oregon, and there is some channelization, but it's not nearly as bad as what you see in the Central Valley in California, where there's basically, I'm exaggerating, there's not a single waterway left that hasn't been altered. And then, so looking in the Central Valley as an agricultural area, and then you look over the Willamette Valley and go, oh, the Willamette Valley has meanders. And you do not, you fly over the Central Valley, Sacramento Valley especially, and you just don't see that. In fact, that's, it's so bad in parts of the Central Valley that basically the water's not flowing the direction it should, you know? So it's so engineered that if you want to figure out, for example, what's happening with applications of fertilizer, if you want to figure out where's it going, it's really hard to figure out because you can't make the normal assumptions about the way that water flows. So it complicates a lot of things that people are trying to figure out about these systems. And all well-intentioned. I'm not trying to slam anyone, but it really long-lasting effects.
There are landowners here that would have put the river back to its normal course.
Yeah. How have they done that? How have landowners put?
A lot of money.
But they've actually redesigned it, and then they put a whole lot of wood and stumps
Okay.
to stop the flow in one direction of it. And it's amazing within a year, the growth that has come back.
Yeah.
Over 4 or 5 years, I don't know if you folks have seen Doug McDaniel's spot, and there are other people up and down the river that are doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's terrific when these systems respond as quickly as they do, and the beavers too. I know there are people who are in favor of beavers and people who are not in favor of beavers, but they make a difference really fast. Yeah.
To do those kind of restoration projects always strikes me as just an astonishing way to spend a whole lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it does. Mission accomplished. It adds in channel diversity, but you could do the same thing just by not touching it for 200 years.
Or maybe even for 25 years, get some beavers going.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. We all want it now. We don't want to wait 200 years. We want it now.
That's what caused this. That's what caused this problem.
We've got all that big equipment, we gotta do something with it.
I do. We want the big equipment and we all want it now. So we've already covered this, more rain, less snow, all of the changes in snowpack that go along with it. So I don't need to reiterate this. Aridity and wildfires, obviously a big concern across the western United States. So, as we have more drought, as we have more heat, vegetation's drier. Wildfires more likely to ignite, more likely to spread. And we were talking about elevation of some of these snow to rain transitions. So wildfires, as higher elevations become drier and have less snow, wildfires are expanding to higher elevations. The overall increase in temperatures overnight is also affecting wildfire. When there's an effort to suppress a wildfire, those high overnight temperatures are also making it more difficult. The interesting thing to me is if you look at causes of wildfires across the United States as a whole, more wildfires human-caused than lightning-caused, and a real difference across Oregon's geography in terms of the proportion of fires that are ignited by lightning versus human causes. And when I say human causes, I'm not talking about arson, although of course there are arson fires. The federal government tracks known causes of ignitions, and they have something like 13, maybe 13, maybe 14, 13 separate categories of human-caused ignitions, and it ranges from kids playing with matches, basically, to power lines, to mechanized equipment, to railroads, to debris burning. Debris burning actually causes more wildfires in Oregon than any other human cause. Not necessarily total area burn, but more wildfires caused by debris burning. And the way that some of us tend to think about it is there's kind of the subset of human causes that is totally preventable. If we're sort of joking around about it, we call it, the stupidity fires, where it was, something like, I like fireworks too. Use of fireworks on 4th of July when it's super dry. Maybe don't do that. That seems quite avoidable versus, certain backfires from vehicles or a railroad or something like that, even, arguably power lines. If there are people and there is infrastructure, some of these ignitions are inevitable. But you see the differences, where the people are, where the vegetation's different, where there tend to be summer storms versus not summer storms, what have you. So in some cases, some of the wildfires potentially can be, we can have fewer of them in places where there's a high proportion of human-caused fires, potentially. And a lot of it's behavioral change. Again, some of it's inevitable, but really interesting to look not only at the sort of is the vegetation primed to go, but where are the sparks coming from? Because you're not going to have the wildfire without the spark.
I always see on Highway 82 or 84, it always looks like somebody may have thrown a cigarette out the window, and so the whole middle of the highway is burned.
Yeah,
That seems to be one of the human.
yeah.
Okay, so on a deeper question, why isn't this map a population proxy? Yes, there's more people on the west side and the east side, but what's going on in the really isolated bits of around Astoria that isn't going on in Hell's Canyon? Both those are pretty isolated places, and the fire response for human cause on that side seems very different. Is this not that climate related at all? Is this just what you get when you mix a lightning map and a human map together?
A little bit of both. So the question was, is this what happens when you mix a lightning map and a human map, human density map together? I mean, where there's higher densities of humans in Oregon also are the places where there tend to be no summer lightning storms. So combination. I mean, most places where there are higher concentrations of people, even in places with summer thunderstorms, you're going to see higher concentrations of human-caused fires. Some of it's recreation. So where are people going and potentially using fire in some way? It's pretty varied. I mean, there's a lot of research going on that, in part supported by the Interagency Joint Fire Science Program, about what's driving human-caused ignitions and what are effective ways to reduce the number of human-caused ignitions. Yeah, so not entirely known, but all ideas welcome.
I'm curious, I had not heard before that the number one cause of human fires was debris burning.
In Oregon.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, this is an area that's a normal thing.
Mm-hmm.
People do debris burning. And, why isn't there a campaign that says statewide, it's an awareness, like a PSA that says, hey folks, they do burn bans and things here, and I think most people follow them, but it's one of those things that it's the first I've heard of this. So that would be raise the awareness, don't toss your big cigarette out the car. But maybe save burning garbage for another day.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question about what messages are likely to be effective locally. It's also really difficult to do research on this. We've found in some of the work we've been trying to do on wildfires that a lot of the restrictions aren't tracked in any, they're not recorded in any kind of centralized location. So even fire use restrictions on national forests, there's nowhere centralized that these are tracked. So if a district ranger, issues an order for fire use restriction, whether it's no campfires, whether it's no stove use, something like that, this isn't tracked anywhere. And you would think that it would be, but it's not. And so a lot of these, it's the same thing at the federal level, largely the same. At least that's what we've been finding at the local level too. So if you go to an emergency management district and say, can you tell me when you had burn bans? Nope. So keeping that information, it would be a start to being able to track. Does there seem to be an association between restrictions and fewer fires? Who knows? A lot of it is going to be awareness, and it's going to be, at least some of us think, people's experience with the place and sort of when is it safe to burn. And hopefully people are keeping track of red flag warnings and local restrictions or what have you, but who knows? Yeah, so that's, a lot of what we were talking about earlier of what seems like it's going to be effective for a particular place, for a particular group of people, for, areas where people have lived for a long time, they tend to be more savvy about the conditions. If you have people moving in, if you have newcomers to an area and maybe they're not as accustomed to fire conditions, or maybe they're, in an area that was hot and humid during summer, it's not going to burn in Louisiana on the coast during summer. What are you, crazy? And then you move here and it's really dry. So, a lot of things contribute to this. And, I joke about stupidity, but I don't think most things are, gross negligence. It's sort of something, there's an oops, or there's a lack of awareness, or it's, instead of slicing your finger, you started a wildfire. Yeah.
And something strikes me strange about this conversation, looking at causes of wildfires and looking at the sort of human side of it.
Mm-hmm.
The gauge of the severity of the fire is the landscape it's burning. And yeah, humans can change that a lot on usage. But people don't say that the Columbia River Gorge fire happened because of that force structure. They say it happened because of some poor kid with a firework.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was what put the spark out. So people are thinking about, in some cases, if there's not much that, in the short term, that one can do about temperatures becoming warmer and areas becoming drier, people can do something about trying to reduce the number of sparks.
It's easier to find scapegoats that way, and it's easier to find an other to blame. I think that the land use is a more holistic thing.
All of the above. Yeah, trying lots of things. If anything, it's the spaghetti analogy. Throw lots and lots and lots of it at the wall, try lots of things. If any of it sticks, great, can't be a bad thing. Yeah. Yeah. There's been work that came out recently, and this is not a surprise. Any natural hazard tends to disproportionately affect people who have fewer economic resources, who have been marginalized in various ways. And in Oregon, this is also the case. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has metrics of what they call social vulnerability. And so this work used the term social vulnerability because it was one of the sources of information was what the CDC calls a social vulnerability index. So there's an increase in the number of people who are disadvantaged in various ways, who are at higher risk, that have been exposed to wildfires in the state from the first decade of this century to the second decade of this century. And this is another, and basically, so this isn't dealing with smoke. That's an important caveat. This is dealing with people that were within wildfire perimeters. So not everyone had to evacuate. Not everyone's homes were lost. But just looking at people that were in the wildfire perimeters. So a real increase in the number of people that are disadvantaged in various ways that were exposed to wildfires. And the population in Oregon over the past 20 years that was within wildfire perimeters proportionally had much higher levels of disadvantage than the Oregon population as a whole. But what becomes interesting, because this is in general a trend across the West Coast, is again that the components of disadvantage differed from location to location. So in some areas, more skewed toward people that were older, people with disabilities, people in group housing, that maybe in other areas, some parts of California, for example, more skewed toward people that have limited English skills. So you get different causes contributing to, so overall increase in exposure of vulnerable populations to wildfire, but the components of vulnerability differ from location to location. And so one of the takeaways from this work was there's not one top-down solution to trying to work with communities to increase their resilience to wildfire. But, again, some of us were talking about this earlier, go into the particular communities. What are your concerns? What are your resources? What do you know about populations in your area that most need various types of support in the event of a wildfire, or to decrease the likelihood of burning in that area? And, go with what those places know that they need. It's getting late, so I'm going to skip through some of this. Fire preparedness in Oregon and in many other places. There are lots of debates about land management. One thing that is highly effective everywhere, although not as easy or cheap in some cases, is hardening homes. So the majority of homes that ignite are not ignited because the vegetation around the house lit on fire and then lit the home on fire. It's because there were sparks that were going well in front of the fire front and they landed on something that was flammable, whether it was a flammable roof, a flammable deck, mulch right next to the house. So home hardening, extremely effective for not losing homes. Builders don't necessarily like this because it increases their costs. It can be expensive to do, renovations of a home or to re-landscape or to try to control those types of things, but it's extremely effective. And there's a lot that can be done, for example, with home ventilation systems so that sparks are less likely to come up in the middle of the house and basically ignite the house from the inside. I shouldn't just say house, any structures. So there are things that can be done. And it was interesting, I was talking with a group of, it's just the fact, there were older women in a suburb of Portland last week, and we were talking about wildfires, and one of them said, what we really need to do is talk with our HOAs and take on some of the HOA policies that, dictate how we build our homes, how we do our landscaping. And it was, you are right on. That is a major impediment in some areas, especially the areas where the homes tend to be really expensive. So, yeah.
You may be about to go into this, but what about some sort of regulations on building in the wildland or in the wildland-urban interface as another step? Because it just seems like, we talked about the folks that don't understand about the burn piles.
Yeah.
We have folks that are moving up and just building up the sides of mountains with no idea of the risk. And also then, of course, all the challenges it puts on our first responders and everybody, the insurance companies. It's just becoming this really, it just makes you scratch your head why we keep doing that up some of these really remote places. Is there any ideas you have for de-incentivizing building in these high-risk areas?
Yeah, so the question was about de-incentivizing building in the wildland-urban interface. If you have the right to vote, talk to your elected officials and let them know how you feel. I mean, all of this is sort of what does society want? People like to live in cute little places in the woods. It's nice until it burns. But I mean, there's a personal choice in some cases, and there's also, people telling their elected officials at every level, this is what's important to us. We want to have these discussions.
I think we're mostly leaving it up to the insurance folks.
I was just going to say, I think the insurance companies right now are climbing into the driver's seat.
Yeah.
When the map of, that first ODF map showing inflammable areas came out, it was, I think it was fairly accurate, but it also was a little, at any rate, it sort of ignited a whole lot of interest in both the insurance industry, and I know that, our house, which is built next to a stream, but also next to forest. Trying to get homeowners insurance on it now is next to impossible. And so I think, if you're looking at, you may be able to buy a piece of land, but getting a permit with insurance on it is not going to be easy anymore.
Yeah, that's a terrific point. So that basically the insurance industry is going to drive where the building goes, or at least where the insured building goes. And the people lost their marbles over that ODF map. The insurance industry knows it. I mean, if there were a lot of concerns about this is going to affect my insurance prices. No, your insurance prices are already going to be affected. I mean, look at what's happening in California. Yeah, and look at what's happening in parts of the country affected by flooding and hurricanes. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, no, our insurance, I think, almost tripled.
Yeah.
So we, at the Giuseppe Center, we did read this book about Paradise and the fire there. And it seemed like, is it the community built itself around being in the forest? And so just trying to desensitize, make people aware that that's, while it's quaint and wonderful, it's also got this danger value.
Yeah, and there's now just to make more acronyms in the world, or more jargon in the world. So many people are familiar with the wildland urban interface, which is basically building a community right up against more or less naturally vegetated areas. There's now also wildland urban intermix, which is basically a patchwork of cute little houses in the woods, or maybe not that cute, eye of the beholder, but not necessarily the houses here and the trees there or the brush there, but interspersed. And again, really difficult for first responders, really, like, if you're doing that, harden the homes. And again, you're absolutely right, Ellen, that this may be driven by the insurance industry, where they may say, the only way we will even conceive of insuring that home is if you build it in this way. Yeah.
The county has actually been progressive in this area.
Okay.
We've mapped our fire risk.
Uh-huh.
We have communities at risk.
Firewise.
Yeah, and Firewise is a little different, but it doesn't matter. Firewise is wonderful. The way it's getting information out to the communities and making money available.
Yeah.
I mean, this is all great until it costs money.
Yeah.
And then it kind of gets difficult, but the signage and the community awareness, and you're getting neighbors to talk to each other over this stuff, it's wonderful, Firewise. But the county actually mapped its fire risk, and there are building codes requirements in place, non-flammable roofs, screen vents.
That's terrific.
All of this stuff.
Yeah.
And defensible space for new construction, not for existing construction. However, that's the thing. That's where Firewise comes in and fills in behind and takes care of existing space.
Yeah.
But we're really being proactive.
That's
here.
terrific.
And I'm enthused.
Yeah.
What we're doing here in the county to address this issue. It would be nice if there wasn't this pressure to build in forested areas. But, people want to do it.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a problem or not, or if there's enough of it, or it's just loud, but the mega rich don't pay any attention to that. And my old high school town of Oceanside, California, is the seas lapping over the street. And my friends down there say, it's okay, they just build they build right there and let the water come through a couple times a year and jock it up a little bit, and they know that's, but the mega rich at night here in California, they're hiring their own fire departments.
Yeah.
They're not insuring their houses, they burn, they build another one, they've got enough money to do that.
Self-insured.
Self-insured.
Well, I'm going to leave it there because no one wants to sit for longer than an hour. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
There are snacks. Let's continue talking. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.